What's the last book you read that hit you with a tidal wave of emotions? You know, one that made you laugh, feel hope, get completely confused, and stare at the ceiling pondering life's meaning, only to be smacked with a pun right after. Let me guess, was it Discworld? Because honestly, there's nothing quite like Terry Pratchett's delightfully chaotic, absurd, and profoundly human series. Even if you haven't read Discworld, you've probably heard of it. It's a veritable giant in modern fiction, and for good reason. But what you may not know is just how massive this series truly is. I certainly didn't, not at first anyway. Discworld started over 4 decades ago, but don't let that time span fool you. It never really slowed down. Now, I was a fan growing up, but like many of us, adulthood and its endless to-do list pulled me away, and wow, have I missed a lot. Dozens of books, some, let's say, interesting adaptations, and news about the author that's been both inspiring and heartbreaking. So in this video, I'm diving headfirst into the sprawling world of Discworld, untangling the many ideas, philosophies, and sheer madness that makes it what it is. We'll explore its very long publication history, its adaptations, both the good and the baffling, and where the series stands today to explore whatever happened to Discworld. Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and welcome to Exits Examines. We will be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and an enormous shout out to my patrons who keep this channel alive. You guys rock. Now, if you're not familiar with Discworld, I simultaneously feel very sad for you, but also deeply jealous. Sad because you missed out on one of the greatest literary playgrounds ever created, but jealous because, oh boy, what a world you have waiting for you. But how do you even explain Discworld? Well, start by throwing in absurdity, toss in equal parts razor-sharp satire and delightfully illogical logic, wrap it in layers of social commentary, and present it all as a fantasy series. It's ridiculous, it's profound, it's hilariously human, and just uniquely Discworld. Now, it's easy to start spiraling on Discworld, but on the surface, here's what it is. Discworld is a fantasy book series by Sir Terry Pratchett that began in 1983. The books often parody or draw inspiration from classic works while taking generous swipes at mythology, folklore, and fairy tales. But more importantly, they use these frameworks to satirize cultural, political, and scientific issues. Now, the books have sold over 80 million copies worldwide, which, if numbers make your eyes glaze over, is roughly the population of Canada and Spain combined. So yeah, people kind of like it. And that's not even including the people who shoplifted it, which apparently Pratchett was the most shoplifted author in the UK. But Discworld is also so much more than that. It's a universe where you'll meet camels who are mathematical geniuses, unionized rats, and Death, yes, that Death, who occasionally moonlights as the disc version of Santa Claus, all on top of some incredible British humor. And if you think that sounds like someone's fever dream, you're not wrong, but please trust me when I say that it works. What sets Discworld apart from other fantasy series like The Lord of the Rings is its structure. It's less a traditional series and more a collection of interconnected miniseries and standalones all set in the same world. Even if you start with the first book, you'll quickly notice that the plots don't string together in a neat continuous arc. Instead, they're like a web of stories running parallel, connected in this unhinged mishmash of reoccurring characters, themes, and that signature Pratchett wit. He's often called the granddaddy of absurd fantasy, and honestly, that feels about right. And right from the very first page, Discworld makes no apologies for its wonderfully chaotic logic. Quote, Discworld is primarily a story about a world. Here it comes now. A brass note sounds. It is a deep, vibrating chord that hints that the brass section may break in at any moment with a fanfare for the cosmos, because the scene is the blackness of deep space with a few stars glittering like the dandruff on the shoulders of God. Then it comes into view. Overhead, bigger than the biggest, most unpleasantly armed star cruiser in the imagination of a 3-ring filmmaker. A turtle, 10,000 miles long. It is Great Atuan, and it carries on its meteor pock shell 4 giant elephants who bear on their enormous shoulders the great round wheel of Discworld. A world like that, which exists only because the gods enjoy a joke, must be a place where magic can survive. Now, if you thought the absurdity of Discworld stopped at the world itself, I clearly have not done my job well enough, because this is a universe packed with heroes, wizards, witches, dwarves, dragons, and a city watch, which exist, yes, but they're all twisted enough to make you do a double take. And Discworld is basically what happens if you took your standard fantasy world but took all the concepts in there, like magic and the implications of magic, to their logical extremes. Like if you sat down and really thought what would happen in a world that combines magic with the delightfully stupid human race. And that's what the genius is here. It's this logic-driven absurdity. Discworld is a world, but more importantly, it's our world just turned sideways. And through this, Pratchett exposes some hilarious and very human truths about ourselves, our history, and our language. And of course, a major vehicle for this exploration comes in the form of Discworld's world building, which is a masterclass in taking fantastical concepts and running them to their logical extremes. Let's take dwarves for example. On the surface, Discworld dwarves look like your standard fantasy fare. Short, bearded, metalworkers, a clear nod to Tolkien. But give them more than a passing glance and things get uniquely Discworld. Take gender for instance. Dwarf society goes out of its way to keep genders ambiguous, with all dwarves, regardless of gender, rocking beards, and courtship being less about romantic gestures and more about the delicate, awkward process of figuring out what gender the other dwarf even is. Instead of the usual gender ambiguity dwarves are usually treated with in other fantasy series, Discworld leans into that ambiguity, and that is just one of the many examples. And of course, what is a fantasy world without magic? And the magic here is delightfully mundane. Magic isn't some flashy wave of the wand, it's a scholarly pursuit with all the boring rules that come with that. Most of the complexity in magic isn't the effect itself, but the safety measures. And also because wizards just seriously love the trappings of wizardry, like dripping candles, even if they aren't exactly needed. No one wants to be the wizard who turns into a puddle because they skip the magical equivalent of reading the safety manual. And don't even get me started on sorcerers. Wizards born to 8 sons of 8 sons of 8 sons. And of course, the incredible home of wizardry called the Unseen University has a motto that roughly translates to "now you see it, now you don't." And even the magical library in it is delightfully twisted. Books here are chained, not to keep students from stealing them, but to keep the students from being stolen by the books. And that's not even to mention the fan favorite librarian who, thanks to a magical accident, has been transformed into an orangutan. And perhaps nowhere is more indicative of the absurd chaos of the books than the main setting for most of the series, Ankh-Morpork. The beating heart of Discworld is a chaotic, hilarious mess of a city. Picture a blend of Prague, 18th century London, 19th century Seattle, and a dash of modern New York City thrown in. It's a place where corruption, pollution, and violence are regular features, and even in the midst of dragon attacks, the vegetable carts still roll in. Situated on the river Ankh, which is so polluted it's rumored to be solid enough to walk on, the city itself is a fictional city-state and the mercantile capital of Discworld. And fascinatingly enough, Ankh-Morpork is constantly evolving, with a rich history of revolution and even eventually going into its very own Discworld industrial revolution. And again, just as another fun aside, because this is a series filled with them, Ankh-Morpork has to have one of the most impressive and hilarious coats of arms around. If that doesn't scream Discworld, I don't know what does. The city also features a ridiculous number of guilds, over 300 of them. Some, like the Thieves Guild, are massive and surprisingly organized because, of course, crime is regulated here. The Beggars Guild, which is the oldest and the wealthiest, and of course the Victims Guild, whose members make their living by contracting out to take hits from the Thieves Guild on behalf of their customers. And this world building isn't just surface level. Pratchett actually does something with them, and these lead to some brilliant setups, like a well-meaning human guard who happened to be raised by dwarves and thought he was a dwarf for a long time, stopping a rowdy dwarf crowd at a tavern by telling them in perfect dwarvish that their poor dwarven mothers, who they never write home to anymore, would be ashamed of their drunken behavior. Or a sphinx being questioned on the logical validity of its riddle, and I could just go on and on, because as the series goes on, and keep in mind this is a pretty massive series we're talking about, we get taken all throughout Discworld to different locations, eras, and all are delightfully as absurd as the next. Everything in it just has this distinct aesthetic and Discworld's feel that's impossible to get from any other media out there. Now, of course, all of this spills into the characters, which, no surprise here, are some of the most absurdly unique, hilariously, and gloriously logical yet ridiculous creations in fiction. Discworld takes familiar archetypes, twists them inside out, and somehow makes them feel both larger than life and weirdly painfully human. Take Cohen the Barbarian. Think Conan, but very, very old. On his first appearance, he's already a wrinkled relic of a warrior, but still absurdly competent because, as he often points out, a man who does what he does for a living and still manages to reach his 90s must be very, very good at it. Then there's Lord Vetinari, Ankh-Morpork's resident, tyrant, and arguably the most competent politician in literature. He's what you get if Steve Jobs and Machiavelli walked into a bar, drank exactly one glass of water, and immediately took over the city. His approach to government is simple: crime legalized, corruption institutionalized. And in one of my favorite scenes, in a rare instance where he gets imprisoned, he's taking control of the local rat population who serve his every whim. But in his words, he's not ruling them, he's merely just giving advice. And speaking of figures that loom over the story, let's talk about Death. Not Death in the abstract sense, but Death the character. Everyone's favorite Grim Reaper with an unsettling fondness for talking in all caps, but small, and kind of with an existential curiosity that makes him one of Discworld's most fascinating figures. He loves cats, and in one of my favorite scenes, he gets blackout drunk and agonizes over what it means to be human, despite, being the personification of mortality. And let's not forget Binky, his horse, a perfectly normal, living, breathing white horse, because as Death discovered, skeletal horses tend to fall apart, and fiery ones keep setting things on fire. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best. Even throwaway characters are just so beautifully and absurdly fleshed out, like a camel who also happens to be the greatest mathematician on the disc. And one of the best things about Discworld is how fragmented yet interconnected it really is. The world isn't just one story, but dozens told from many different perspectives. Reoccurring characters pop in and out, making the setting feel alive and layered, and the interactions between these characters are as insightful as they are hilarious. Take the character Vimes, another fan favorite whose rise from alcoholic policeman, or drunk as he refers to himself, stating that he is nowhere near rich enough to have been considered an alcoholic, to a respected member of the aristocracy, and his begrudging acceptance of his role as the commander of the City Watch. Now his and the patricians' interactions are pure gold. Quote, "Commander, I always used to consider that you had a definite anti-authoritarian streak in you. Sir, it seems that you managed to retain this even though you are authority. Sir, that's practically Zen." End quote. Or the time Death had a near Vimes experience. And honestly, these moments and Discworld as a whole are some of the funniest in literature, and I don't think I've ever laughed so much at a series in my life. It's the perfect blend of sharp British humor, self-awareness, and fourth wall-breaking moments. A lot of the comedy comes from Pratchett's witty narrative voice and his brilliant footnotes. Sometimes you'll read a line, think, wait, what? And then have to go back and reread it 2 or 3 times before understanding what actually was being said hits you like a ton of bricks, because bear in mind there's wordplay, double meaning, and philosophy in almost every single line. Quote, "All the shops have been smashed open. There's a whole bunch of people across the street helping themselves to musical instruments. Can you believe that?" "Yeah," said Rincewind. "Looters, I expect." End quote. And sorry, I can't help myself because there are just too many incredible quotes to choose from. Quote, "Give a man fire and he's warm for a day, but set fire to him and he's warm for the rest of his life." End quote. Now, that all being said, it would be an enormous disservice to Discworld to say that it is just humor. At first glance, it might just seem like a mishmash of quirky parodies and fantasy cliches, but dig a little deeper and you'll find that Pratchett's work also tackles some of the most human and real-world issues out there, like religion, fundamentalism, politics, and social inequality. Underneath all the witty one-liners, there's a deep humanism and a surprising amount of moral and philosophical explorations. The series can lull you into a false sense of security with its absurdity, but don't be fooled. There are some profound messages that are subtly and not so subtly raised. Take this bit for instance. Quote, "Down there," he said, "are people who will follow any dragon, worship any god, ignore any inequity. All out of this kind of humdrum, everyday badness. Not the really high, creative loathsomeness of the great sinners, but a sort of mass-produced darkness of the soul. Sin, you might say, without a trace of originality. They accept evil not because they say yes, but because they don't say no." End quote. Or another example is this great exchange between Susan and Death. Quote, "Humans need fantasy to be human. Tooth fairies? Yes. As practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies. So we can believe the big ones? Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. They're not the same at all. You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy, and yet you act as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. Yes, but people have got to believe that, or what's the point? My point exactly. End quote. Pratchett just had this incredible knack for picking apart the English language, breaking it down, using myths, legends, and folklore, then piecing them all back together with a modern twist. One minute you're in a Macbeth-like tragedy, and the next you're caught up in a murder mystery, and then you're tossed into a coming-of-age story. It can be overwhelming, but in the best possible way, because in Discworld there are so many ideas, themes, and emotions swirling around in this whirlwind of genius, and on top of this, there's not even chapters to the book, because of course, Pratchett didn't really believe in them. And this seamless blend of styles and comedy and insight is what makes the writing so special. Discworld isn't just funny, it's thought-provoking and all-encompassing. From philosophy, religion, gender, and the effects of industrialization, it's an exhaustive list of things that matter, wrapped in humor, but never trivialized, and again, feeling so human. Because one of the reoccurring discussions you'll see on Discworld is how Pratchett was driven by a, quote, deep-seated moral anger about the stupid things humans do. So speaking of that, who could have created such a brilliantly absurd yet deeply human work? Well, none other than Terry Pratchett himself. Now, Pratchett wasn't just a writer, he was a pioneer in how he interacted with his fans. He was one of the first to use the internet to communicate directly with them, and as you may expect, he was a man of many interests, and I was surprised to learn that he was actually an avid video gamer, listing Half-Life and Thief as his favorites. And just to give you another taste of the man, he was knighted for his services to literature, and in true Pratchett fashion, he famously forged his own sword from meteorite metal. And it's no wonder while many other fandoms have had their fair share of existential crisis dealing with authors with complicated viewpoints, Pratchett is seemingly universally loved by his fanbase. In an interview when describing Discworld, he said, quote, "There was a lot of fun stuff that happens that I wanted to put in, and in effect, that's what Discworld happens to be." And I think that really just sums up Discworld. And it's no surprise that these books sold extremely well, and Discworld has a dedicated fan base in the US, although it never received the same level of saturation that it did in the UK. So if you're anything like me, some of your books may be, well, let's just say well-loved, with some not-so-glamorous coffee stains. Hey, it happens, but why not treat yourself and your poor, battered books to something that will keep them cozy and protected? Well, that's where today's sponsor, Book Beau, comes in. They make gorgeous book sleeves that aren't just about protection, they also look amazing too. And it's actually not just for books, whether you're toting around a Kindle, iPad, or even a Switch, they got you covered. With my personal favorite probably being the Game Boy inspired sleeve, because come on, you gotta represent. They even got reading pillows if you want to be super comfy. Now, one of the best things about this channel is getting to shout out small businesses who actually care about reading and also their products and their customers, and I'm really excited to support these folks. So go ahead, treat yourself and your books to something nice, and check out Book Beau using the code below, which is ExitsExamined10, to get a nice 10% off your order and keep those pages pristine in style. Again, Exits10 to get a nice comfy 10% off your next order. All right, back to the video. Okay, so what actually makes up the Discworld series? Well, like with everything Discworld, it can seem a bit overwhelming at first. And actually, yes, it is, but also, no, it's not. Okay, so let me explain. If you look at pure word count, Discworld is up there, like right next to the Wheel of Time, especially when you consider the massive amount of mainline books and companion books. But once you grasp its peculiar logic, it's surprisingly manageable, because unlike Wheel of Time, it's not sequential and you can read as little or as much as you like. So pick up any book in the series and it'll make sense. In total, there are 41 mainline novels, but the most confusing thing for newcomers is that Discworld doesn't move along in a neat linear order. Instead, it meanders, leaps sideways, and sometimes sprints off in a completely different direction. And honestly, I haven't encountered another series that pulls off this kind of delightful narrative chaos. The early books were more like one-shots, but as the series grew, Pratchett settled into more ensemble casts and ongoing sub-series. Fortunately though, most books stand on their own. You can pick up just about any one because Pratchett was excellent at weaving in background information naturally, so you're rarely lost. However, Pratchett himself said that he didn't think people should start with the first book, The Color of Magic, since in his words, it wasn't his best work. And the first few chronologically can feel a bit meandering and just like things are happening for the sake of happening. So what about those sub-series that I mentioned? Well, they focus on different characters and themes, and some of the standouts include the death novels following, Death as he is going through a midlife crisis. Sometimes he even takes a break from reaping souls to live a quote-unquote more normal life, and occasionally moonlighting as Discworld's version of Santa Claus at one point. It sounds absurd, yes, but this is Discworld. Then we also got the Witches novels focusing on, you guessed it, witches, including fan favorites Nanny Ogg and Granny Witherwax, with a serious dose of common sense and a little magic and some Shakespeare references thrown in for good measure. Then we have the City Watch novels, which may be the most beloved set. These follow the Ankh-Morpork City Watch, where Commander Sam Vines goes from a burnout cop to someone who begrudgingly saves the city and occasionally the world. These books mix murder mysteries, social issues, and cop dramas, but at their hearts, they're also about learning what it means to do the right thing and realizing that growth takes a lot of work. So the question you'll see time and time again when it comes to Discworld is, how the are you supposed to read all of these? And this has got to be one of the only series where the most common type of YouTube video or Reddit post is how to pick it apart. Well, the short answer is just pick up any book you want and start reading. But the long answer is, well, there are several schools of thought. And honestly, none of them are wrong, aside from please don't start at the first novel. Some people recommend starting with Guards, with some people thinking it's the first Discworld book in its fully realized form. From there, you can follow sub-series like the City Watch, dipping into earlier novels when you feel like it. If you're the visual type, there are some gorgeous and wildly helpful reading guides out there, including an official one on Pratchett's website and fan-made ones, which I'll link below. But when it comes down to it, how you approach Discworld is totally up to you. If you want to experience a little bit of everything, jump around and explore different parts of the world. But if you prefer a more organized ride, stick with one sub-series at a time. No matter what, there's something for everyone. Even younger readers, thanks to a whole sub-series like the Tiffany Achey novels, although those can be just as deep and philosophical. At the end of the day, just enjoy the journey. There's no wrong way to read Discworld. You could completely ignore everything I just said and read the books in chronological order, which is actually a cool way to watch Pratchett's writing evolve. Honestly, almost every fan has read the books in different orders, so just grab your nearest Discworld book and get to it. We'll wait. And actually, even if you're not a fantasy person, there are books here for you because of the Science of Discworld series. And as you may have guessed from the title, it's a deep dive into physics, which is one of the most unique concepts for a sub-series on fantasy I've come across, with the books being more like thought experiments that use Discworld as a springboard to explore real-world science, and they're filled with some really interesting facts, like the terrifying one that when scientists first tested nuclear reactions, there was a non-zero chance that the chain reaction wouldn't stop, potentially setting the world on fire. Now, spoiler, it didn't, but still, yikes. And if that still isn't enough Discworld for you, don't worry, because Pratchett also dabbled in short stories, essays, and collaborative works. Some of these are collected in A Blink of the Screen in 2012, which is a treasure trove of Pratchett's fiction spanning his entire career. One standout has got to be Turntables of the Night in 1989, which is a short story featuring a record collector and death, because of course he shows up outside the disc too. More recently, A Stroke of the Pen, The Lost Stories in 2023 gathered rediscovered early works by Pratchett, pieces written under a pseudonym and only linked to him decades later. And some of these stories include early hints of Discworld ideas before they fully took shape. Now, many of these stories are floating around online, and I'll link a few below if you're curious. They're quick reads, but they offer a whole new appreciation of how Pratchett's ideas simmered long before the disc took shape. Now, if you're the kind of person who needs a map to truly immerse yourself in a world, I totally get it, and I'm right there with you. Although Pratchett might disagree with you, saying, quote, "There are no maps. You can't map a sense of humor," end quote. Yet, despite that sentiment, there are indeed several official Discworld maps. There are a few primary maps, and a few of these include the Streets of Ankh-Morpork in 1993, the Discworld map in 1995, and Death's Domain in 1999. More recently, there's also been the Complete Ankh-Morpork City Guide in 2012 and the Complete Discworld Atlas in 2015, and a lot of these are seriously gorgeous, complete with some really great material that's excellently illustrated. So you may think we're done, but oh no, my Discworld amigo, we are just scratching the surface, because the Discworld universe isn't just about the main novels, it's a sprawling treasure trove of companion books, and there are way too many to even actually mention by name. But a few standouts are the Unseen University Challenge in 1996, which is a quiz book cramming over 800 questions across categories like arcane history and dwarf studies. And foodies rejoice too, because you have Nanny Ogg's cookbook, which brings recipes you probably shouldn't attempt, like toffee rats on a stick, along with Ogg's unique life advice. Another standout has got to be The Art of Discworld in 2004, with some stunning interpretations of beloved characters. There's also an Ankh-Morpork doodle map, which is a gorgeous map of, well, Ankh-Morpork that you can color in yourself. And again, this is just scratching the surface. Like I mentioned, there are too many companion books to mention, and in short, if you love Discworld, there is something out there with your name on it. Because the sheer scope of Discworld's extended media is frankly bananas, and we probably wouldn't have it any other way. So as you can probably guess by now, the world of Discworld Adaptations is also unsurprisingly vast, and honestly, it makes sense. When you've got a sprawling beloved fantasy series like Discworld, studios are bound to be very eager to adapt it. And the great thing about this is because of the range of Discworld books, a lot of these adaptations focus on wildly different novels and different styles. So strap into your mathematician genius camels, because we are going to be diving in. Now, these started way back in the 90s with Cosgrove Hall, which tackled several Discworld adaptations in the late 90s. And fun fact, they already adapted Pratchett's Truckers in 1992, so this wasn't even their first Pratchett rodeo. Now, their Discworld efforts included Welcome to Discworld in 1996, Soul Music in 1997, and Weird Sisters in 1997 as well. Now, the animation itself is charmingly 90s, and the dialogue is surprisingly faithful to the books, like pretty much line for line. And in fact, these may just be the best adaptations from a purely adaptation sense. And they also include an incredible death voiced by none other than Christopher Lee himself. Now, if you're not into animations, no worries, because Sky One swooped in during the late 2000s with a live-action Discworld trilogy, bringing Hogfather in 2006, The Color of Magic in 2008, and Going Postal in 2010 to television screens. Now, while these adaptations capture much of Discworld's humor and spirits, and actually are incredibly commendable considering they weren't exactly huge budget, they are not without flaws. Pacing issues plague The Color of Magic, and some plot points get reshuffled in ways that will make book purists wince. Still, Going Postal in particular is a standout, and not a bad place to start if you're more of a movie person. Now, in a totally different direction, there was The Amazing Maurice in 2022. Now, this one was a UK-German co-production CGI animated film, which adapted, you guessed it, The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents, with a screenplay from the same person who co-wrote Shrek. Now, it seems like the consensus was that it was generally good, with much of the original dialogue making it onto the screen, again with some bits being lifted word for word. Sure, certain scenes were trimmed for time, and it does soften some of Pratchett's signature bites, although not by much, because after all, there still is a dog ring scene in there, but overall, it's just really cool to see a CGI interpretation of Discworld. And that's not even getting into all the canceled projects. Like, did you know that Disney once had its eyes on Mort? Alas, IP disputes put that project 6 feet under, but it is really kind of fascinating to wonder if it would have taken off and been Disney's next big thing. But although most of the adaptations were pretty good, not all were created equal. Because in 2021, we got The Watch by BBC, which should have and could have been the adaptation Discworld deserved, because after all, it mashed together elements from Guards, Men-at-Arms, and Night Watch. But the issue was, like, as an adaptation, it just wasn't so good, and it was trying so hard to be edgy and different, and in doing so, it kind of left behind the heart of the source material. Vimes went from a world-weary hero to a drunken caricature. Death lost his signature gravitas, and the costume department seemingly raided a Mad Max convention. Longtime fans were unsurprisingly not thrilled, and this seems to be loathed by most of the Pratchett world, especially because these books were some of the most beloved of the series, and the show lost so much of Pratchett's witty social commentary. With a 53% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, The Watch has sadly become infamous for alienating both newcomers and dedicated readers alike. But that's not to say it's not entirely without merits. If you squint and ignore the Discworld label, just take it as a fun show, there are a few laughs and entertaining moments. Now, if you are understandably not feeling the recent adaptations, don't worry because we're nowhere near done. In fact, what if I told you that the most numerous Discworld adaptations weren't TV shows or movies? Because it's probably board games, and like the books themselves, these games are wildly different in concept, execution, and vibe. And the best part is that you don't even need to be a Discworld fan to really enjoy most of them. First up, we got Thud in 2002, inspired by ancient Norse games like Nifltauffel, which, sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, which if you're like me and had no idea, is basically uneven chess that pits two asymmetrical sides, trolls and dwarves, against each other. It actually has a gorgeous board with hefty, beautifully crafted pieces and some really strategic gameplay. But if that's too cerebral, how about Guards in 2011? This one is a quest-driven game where players scurry around Ankh-Morpork collecting stolen spells to return to the Unseen University, all while dodging familiar Discworld characters. On the flip side, we got Ankh-Morpork in 2011 and is probably one of the more beloved entries, and it's easy to see why. You take control of iconic characters like the Patrician, each with distinct victory conditions, and gameplay revolves around area control and building influences across the city, and the consensus is that it's pretty solid. Then there's The Witches in 2013, where you basically play as trainee witches, solving problems that range from sick pigs to pregnancy and, hey, even death itself. Now, if speed is your thing, Clax in 2014 might be your jam. Based on the messaging system in Going Postal, players race to send messages across a constantly shifting board while sabotaging their opponents. It's actually pretty quick to learn and chaotic in a really good way, and totally playable even if you've never cracked open a Discworld novel. And for the hardcore fans among you, there is Cripple Mr. Onion, which is a card game that pops up throughout the books. Now, multiple fan-made versions exist, including a rule set approved by Pratchett himself, because of course he'd give a nod to something this delightfully obscure. Now, for those of you who are thinking, okay, these are great, but where's my Discworld tabletop RPG? Relax, it exists. We got GURPS Discworld in 1997, as well as a sequel, which is a comprehensive tabletop role-playing system co-written by none other than Pratchett himself. Now, if you're familiar with GURPS, which stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System, it's basically a flexible tabletop role-playing game system. But if you're in the mood for something a bit more modern, there is Adventures in Ankh-Morpork, which is another tabletop RPG in the works. And from what's been shown so far, it looks absolutely incredible with illustrations from people who have worked on other official Discworld products. Now, if all of that still isn't enough for you, I get it, but also don't worry, there are even more adaptations because of course we've got video games, baby. During the series Meteoric Rise, there were plenty of offers to adapt Discworld into games, but Pratchett was pretty cautious, not wanting to hand over the rights to just anyone. But eventually he did, and the first one that came out of this was The Color of Magic in 1986. Now, this one is a text-based game and loosely follows the events of the novel of the same name and occasionally tossing in bland graphics, but let's just say they wouldn't win any beauty contest. Now, Pratchett was pleased with the game itself, but voiced disappointments at its poor marketing. And then came the point-and-click adventure games of the mid-90s, and this is where things get interesting. Discworld 1995 and Discworld 2, Missing Presumed in 1996 are great. Honestly, I never heard of these before researching this video, and I kind of feel robbed because they're delightful Discworld experiences through and through, and the graphics are really actually great, especially considering they're made in the 90s and the world feels distinctly Discworld. But just a heads up that these games are tough, and also I mean like 90s version of tough. There's also Discworld Mud in 1991. Now, if you're unfamiliar with these are multi-user dungeons. Imagine basically a text-based MMO where you type commands to explore and interact with a sprawling world. It's supposed to be a little rough around the edges, but it's still alive and accessible today, and I'll drop a link below if you want to check it out for yourself, which I highly recommend. And then in a totally unexpected turn, there's actually Discworld Noir in 1999, which is a gritty detective story of all things set on the disc, complete with a private investigator who, yes, gets murdered at the very start of the game, which is quite the intro. Now, I was not able to play it, but watching Let's Plays and reading reviews, it actually looks really cool, and the visuals seemed awesome for the time, and the atmosphere just looked top-notch. But very unfortunately, it was only released in Europe due to publisher issues, which is a shame because it's often cited by developers as a hidden gem and one of their favorite games. And that seems to be the end of Discworld video games, which is frankly a tragedy. With a world this rich, how do we not have a modern RPG or strategy game set on the disc? Assassin's Creed, give me an open world game where I can join the Assassin's Guild or negotiate with the patrician. But wait, there is more Discworld and we're not done yet. If you've somehow managed to explore all the adaptations and media, A, I don't believe you, and B, you deserve your own intelligent luggage companion. Besides the games, there have been plays, BBC radio adaptations, musicals, and a treasure trove of audiobooks, many of which are brilliantly performed. Like, I cannot overstate that enough. And comics, yeah, they're in there too. We got graphic novels, although the quality does kind of vary because they were published between 1996 and 2016, and they often cut content to fit the format, and they were also done all by different authors. Also, don't confuse these with the illustrated editions. Eric and the Last Hero feature stunning artwork with these sprawling, bizarre illustrations that really, in my opinion, capture the chaotic Discworld energy perfectly, although I can understand if they aren't for everyone. So there you have it, the sprawling, wonderfully chaotic history of Discworld adaptations, and for a series as massive as this, it's fitting that the adaptations are just as varied and unpredictable. Now, I tried my very best to at least mention them all, but if I missed your favorite, please let me know. The world is just too big to cover every nook and cranny, and that's kind of part of what makes Discworld so magical. So with all these wildly varied adaptations flying around, you'd think that Discworld is still going full steam ahead, but that brings us to the question, what is the state of the series today? Well, when it comes to the mainline books, it's pretty bittersweet. Terry Pratchett was diagnosed in 2007 with a rare form of early onset Alzheimer's. But like with all things Pratchett, he took it in stride, and in a published statement on his website, he called the diagnosis, quote, an unbuggerance, and said he was taking the news fairly philosophically and possibly with mild optimism. And commendably enough, he continued to write Discworld novels until 2015, which was the same year he passed away. Now, Pratchett was, to put it mildly, a fascinating human being. His views on life and death were sometimes controversial, and honestly, his life alone could fill an entire video. And if you want to deep dive on that, I'm sure you're already aware of the incredible YouTube channel Biographics, which has a fascinating breakdown, which I'll link below. As for the future of Discworld, since Pratchett's passing, his daughter Rihanna, who actually wrote AAA video games like BioShock Infinite and is a co-director to the estate of Discworld, has been pretty clear. She tweeted, quote, I'll work on adaptations, spin-offs, maybe tie-ins, but the books are sacred to Dad, end quote. And fair enough, Pratchett's voice is so singular that continuing the mainline books without him would be like trying to write new Shakespeare plays. Theoretically possible, but pretty much heresy. That said, Discworld is hardly lying dormant. We've seen companion books, new adaptations, and Rihanna has expressed interest in exploring video game tie-ins. And given the series' enduring popularity, I doubt the Discworld universe will be closing shop anytime soon. It just won't be through new novels, and maybe that's for the best. The disc was Pratchett's world. Trying to replicate that voice would be like giving someone else the keys to the unseen university's library. Dangerous, confusing, and potentially full of things that bite back. But don't worry, while the mainline books have ended, the fandom is alive and delightfully unhinged in the best possible way. Now, in my time running this channel, I've seen some passionate fan bases, but Discworld fans bring a special kind of creative fire. The Discworld subreddit alone is one of the biggest out there and is packed with everything from favorite Pratchett quotes to jaw-dropping LEGO recreations of Discworld, and of course some amazing Halloween costumes. And you best believe that this carries over to the real world as well, with a number of ongoing Discworld conventions around the world. Then there are the fan projects, which I don't even know where to start. We got Trollbridge, which isn't really a fan project. It's a short film that's frankly absurdly high quality, made by Snowgum Films and funded by the fandom. Pratchett wrote extra bits of dialogue for this amazing short film, and it's available for free on YouTube. We also got Mort in 2001 and Lords and Ladies in 2005, which are lower budget fan-made movie adaptations that, while rough around the edges, are absolutely bursting with heart. Then, of course, there's a ton of podcasts out there, with one standout in particular being Pratchett, which goes through all the books discussing them in details. And I know I've said this a lot, but again, that's just scratching the surface. Fan art, fan fiction, and stunning merchandise from Discworld Emporium, which, by the way, has its own brick-and-mortar location and carries its own Ankh-Morpork passport. And this brings us to the inevitable question, why? Why does the series, set on a flat world carried by 4 elephants on the back of a giant turtle, ignite such lasting passion? Well, I'm sure Discworld resonated with different people in different ways because there's just so much to it. But if I had to guess, well, I guess there's just something in here for everyone. The books are easy to read, but layered with razor-sharp wit and a surprising depth of wisdom. You pick up a Discworld novel expecting laughs and end up confronting the absurdities of our own worlds. And it's no wonder that the books remain as relevant to society today as when they were written. But it's important to note that beneath all that satire, there is a strong undercurrent of hope. And not to get too poetic here, but in a time where so many stories feel like they've been focused grouped into oblivion, when aesthetics are recycled into AI-generated sludge, Discworld stands out as something refreshingly, stubbornly human. It's one man's unapologetic vision, messy, brilliant, funny, and deeply compassionate. His characters stumble, fail, get back up, and sometimes save the world, even if it is by accident. These books champion thinking for yourself, questioning authority, and embracing the chaos of life. This series isn't just books. It's a community, a philosophy, and a wonderfully weird lens through which to view the universe. And as long as people keep finding humor in the darkness, hope, and absurdity, well, that incredible world of Discworld on top of the great Atuan will keep on going through space. I want to give an enormous shout out to We Are Better Than a Poke in the Eye by Jason and Rachel for helping me fact check and bounce ideas off of. I also want to give another shout out to Jinshi on Reality from the Discworld Mud, again for fact checking and bouncing ideas off of. And finally, another shout out to Rincewind, again for the incredible help. No shout out is ever complete without shouting out my incredible patrons who literally keep this channel alive. I could not do this without you. Thank you. If you want to find out more ways to support me, I'll link them below in the description. Now, as always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. It's always really interesting to hear what you guys have to say. Anyway, thanks again, and I'll see you next time.